Sir, on Iran, the Supreme Leader today said that U.S. attack could spark a regional war. Giving your response to that, sir?
Why wouldn't he say that? Of course you're going to say that, but we have the biggest, most powerful ships in the world over there, very close, a couple of days, and hopefully we'll make a deal.
The world suddenly found itself holding its breath as reports surfaced that the United States and Iran might be preparing to meet face-to-face in Turkey for a long-anticipated round of diplomatic talks, even as threats and warnings from both sides rattled the region's already unstable geopolitical landscape. What makes this moment so striking is not just the prospect of dialogue, but the stark contrast between that possibility and the fierce rhetoric both capitals have traded in recent days. At stake are questions of war and peace, nuclear proliferation, economic pressure, and the fragile balance of power not only in the Middle East, but across global security orders. The seeds of this diplomatic effort were planted amid rising tensions that brought U.S. naval forces closer to Iranian waters than at any point in years. A senior U.S. official says that Washington is ready to engage in serious negotiations with Tehran to reach a nuclear deal in the coming days, and that intermediaries, including Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar, are coordinating to help facilitate a meeting in Ankara between U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and senior Iranian officials. These developments come at a moment of high drama. Iran's supreme leader has taken to social media to warn that any American military strike would not remain isolated but could plunge the broader region into war. Such a declaration raises the stakes dramatically, underscoring the very real risks of deeper conflict. President Donald Trump has responded by dismissing the severity of these Iranian warnings, portraying them as expected rhetorical posturing. Trump continues to emphasize the strength of U.S. forces deployed near Iran and insists that Washington's posture is meant to support diplomacy rather than trigger war. His remarks highlight a consistent theme in this administration's strategy, which blends pressure with the possibility of negotiation, making clear that diplomacy remains the preferred path, but that other options remain fully available if talks collapse. This combination of diplomatic engagement and military muscle has shaped international reactions. On the one hand, Trump's public emphasis on the presence of powerful U.S. naval units in the Gulf is meant to reinforce American seriousness about preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. The deployment of the USS Abraham Lincoln and accompanying destroyers is widely interpreted as both a signal of strength and a bargaining chip aimed at convincing Tehran to return to the negotiating table with meaningful concessions. Yet beneath the surface, experts note that this is not the first time diplomacy has been offered to Iran. Diplomatic paths have long existed, and some analysts argue that recent conflict could have been avoided or tempered if Tehran had seized earlier opportunities to engage constructively with international counterparts. In this view, the current invitation to talks amounts to a last-ditch effort amid intensifying pressure from sanctions and military readiness. Whether or not Iran will respond with concrete proposals rather than cautionary rhetoric remains an open question. One factor that may be increasing Tehran's willingness to consider negotiations is deep economic distress. Iran's economy has been battered by sanctions, internal mismanagement, and the fallout from domestic unrest. Hardship among ordinary Iranians and declining oil revenue have left Tehran with fewer levers of leverage, which, in turn, may make negotiations more appealing from a pragmatic standpoint. However, significant political and ideological barriers still stand in the way of meaningful compromise, even if economic necessity nudges Tehran toward the negotiating table. Despite these pressures, the U.S. position remains clear. Denuclearization is a red line. Washington insists that any deal must include verifiable and irreversible measures that prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. This demand has been central in previous rounds of negotiations and remains the cornerstone of American strategy in the current moment. It reflects deep concerns that a nuclear-armed Iran would destabilize the region still further and embolden Tehran's network of allied militias and proxies across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The urgency surrounding these talks is heightened by fresh intelligence showing signs that Iran is rebuilding sites at its nuclear facilities that were damaged during the conflict and strikes known to Western governments as Operation Midnight Hammer. Satellite imagery has revealed activity at key installations in Natanz, Esfahan, and Fordow, suggesting that Tehran may be repairing or fortifying structures that were hit by previous military operations. While such reconstruction could be defensive in nature, to Washington it raises serious questions about Iran's intentions and the pace of its nuclear program. If Tehran continues to rebuild and expand its nuclear infrastructure without limits, experts warn, it could reduce the window for diplomacy and push the U.S. closer to considering military options. Many analysts believe that military action is still very much on the table, especially if Iran refuses to agree to a verifiable deal that clearly halts its nuclear ambitions. Given Tehran's past behavior, including its historically opaque approach to nuclear development and its repeated resistance to intrusive inspections, some within Washington see force, not to topple the regime, but to cripple its nuclear capabilities, as a regrettable but necessary fallback. This view reflects a growing impatience with what critics describe as Tehran's pattern of delay, obfuscation, and tactical negotiation without substantive concessions. Importantly, though, officials in Washington stress that any military action would be limited in scope and aimed squarely at nuclear facilities or delivery systems, not regime change. The administration has attempted to differentiate its stance from past large-scale interventions, arguing that the goal is coercive pressure designed to secure compliance, not to upend the Iranian political system. This distinction is critical, since any perceived intention to overthrow the government would likely provoke not only Iranian resistance, but also sharp criticism from allies wary of another protracted Middle East conflict. However, even as U.S. officials insist on the preference for diplomacy, hesitation and mistrust on the Iranian side complicate the picture. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and other leaders have publicly insisted that there are no formal talks planned with the United States under current conditions, noting that preparatory work, both on substance and venue, must come first before any meaningful engagement. These remarks reflect Tehran's desire to avoid being seen as conceding to pressure or negotiating under duress while its military and nuclear capacities grow. Regional dynamics further complicate the negotiation environment. Turkey, a key regional power and NATO member, has positioned itself as a potential facilitator for de-escalation. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan have both reiterated that diplomacy and dialogue are the preferred avenues for resolving disputes between Iran and the United States. Ankara's efforts to bring the two sides together reflect broader international anxieties about a possible escalation that could engulf neighboring countries and disrupt vital shipping lanes, such as the Strait of Hormuz. Yet for all the diplomatic energy being expended, the path to a successful deal is far from certain. Iranian leaders have used public speeches and state media to characterize American military pressure as intimidation, even as foreign ministers speak positively of mediation efforts. Tehran's response underscores a deeper dilemma: how to reconcile national pride, geopolitical strategy, and domestic pressures with a pragmatic need to avoid economic collapse or full confrontation with the United States. As these diplomatic channels slowly take shape, the broader geopolitical context cannot be ignored. Allies in Europe and the Middle East are watching closely, with some supportive of American leadership but cautious about the risks of military escalation. Others, like Turkey, emphasize negotiation and fear the consequences of another large-scale Middle East conflict. Against this backdrop, the planned talks in Turkey, whether formalized or not, represent both a glimmer of hope and a reminder of how fragile peace can be when power, pride, and geopolitics collide. What unfolds next, whether a breakthrough deal, a prolonged stalemate, or another flare-up of violence, will reverberate far beyond the negotiating table. The stakes could not be higher. A nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable to Washington and many regional partners, yet the consequences of renewed warfare would be grave for millions of people across the Middle East and beyond. Diplomacy, pressure, deterrence, and brinkmanship are now intertwined in a complex and potentially explosive moment in modern history. If you want to stay informed as this story continues to develop on multiple fronts, hit the subscribe button for more future uploads.